Hi, everybody. My name's Lily. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm joining you from Dakota Land in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Welcome to the role of sci-fi and imagination in climate solutions. I'm the Climate Solutions series producer for the Great Northern. The series focuses in on how to highlight the ways that we can both foster connections, bring new awareness to what's working, and what's inspiring about climate solutions. Most of what we do also has some connection to Minnesota and the Midwest. And we're excited to have this broader conversation with writers from across the country about imagination and science fiction in climate solutions. A couple of thank yous to get us started. I want to thank the McKnight Foundation for their sponsorship of this series as a whole and Milkweed Editions for their partnership on this event. I have a note from Milkweed and their team as well. Milkweed Editions is a nonprofit independent publishing house based in Minneapolis and is the proud publisher of the Metamorphosis anthology in partnership with GRIST, whose authors you'll hear from today. They send their collective gratitude to the incredible panelists and to the Great Northern Festival. They're so grateful to partner with the Great Northern yet again to be able to help make these conversations possible. So for today, we're excited to have a conversation about the role of imagination through climate science fiction and beyond, how that can serve as a balm and a tool for tackling the climate crisis. We are joined by GRIST's climate fiction editor or climate fiction manager, Tori Stevens, who will be in conversation with Lewis Evans and Jamie Liu. And hopefully we'll also be joined by Sanjana Sakar, who are all authors in this anthology. During the session, you'll hear from these creatives. I'll be here for any tech questions in the chat. Just look for the Great Northern as a panelist for questions, and we'll have some time to get to audience questions at the end in addition to the conversations from the panelists. So drop curiosities in the Q&A function, which is along your functions bar. With that, I would love to welcome our panelists to the proverbial stage and have them turn on their videos, and we'll dive into it. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Lily. I appreciate it. Thanks to the Great Northern Festival and to Milkweed for allowing us to have this conversation. What's given me energy today is this. I love speaking with Jamie and Lewis. I've spoken with them before, so happy to chop it up. But before we get started, I thought it would be just interesting and um, just what I should be doing, which is explaining what the project is, Imagine 2200, and what GRIST is. So my name is Tori Stevens, as Lily said. I am the creative manager and founder of Imagine 2200, which is a climate fiction initiative at GRIST. GRIST itself, the organization I work out of, is a independent nonprofit media organization, and it's actually been around for 25 years. This is our 25th year. We're celebrating that 25 years of bold climate reporting. And so, yeah, we launched, they've been doing news. GRIST has been doing news for many years. And 5 years ago, we launched a climate fiction initiative. And that initiative sources stories from all over the globe, from everywhere, Nigeria, New York, Los Angeles, like everywhere. We're literally getting right now, and actually from the first year, we received 1,200 stories in the first year of the initiative, and we've kind of kept up that rate of stories when we put out the call for submissions. So what are we looking for? We look for stories that are hopeful, that are focused on climate solutions, that are focused on justice, that are very culturally authentic. If we're sourcing stories from around the world, we really want them to showcase the worlds in which people live and explore and eat. And so you'll see a lot of just everything that has to do with a particular culture in a story. And we really like to highlight that. The other facets of the call for submissions that we put out there is that we're looking for characters that are really dynamic and intersectional. And yeah, of course, we're also looking for climate solutions. So we're going to chop it up for a bit with Jamie and Lewis, who both submitted stories and actually were winners. We took the stories that won for that particular year and packaged them into a book called Metamorphosis. And Milkweed Editions is the publisher for that book. It's been out for about 3 months. I think I got my math right. And so we're going to talk about those stories. We're going to talk about the role imagination plays in climate fiction and science fiction, kind of the genre writ large. And we'll talk about some other things adjacent to that. And then we'll turn it over to you all and have some answer some of the questions that you put in the Q&A section. So for my first question, I guess I'll make this a group question. So it's to both of you. I'm kind of just riffing here, but it's about what we've talked about, and we've talked about this many times because we've been in conversation. But you know, I see decolonizing our imagination as a big part of the climate fiction that we do at GRIST and Imagine 2200. And I'll start for the audience define that by saying decolonizing our imagination loosely is a process of critically examining and dismantling the ways in which our thoughts, beliefs, and perspectives are shaped by colonial history and its enduring legacies. So our project centers marginalized voices, challenges dominant narratives, rejects extractivist narratives, and moves beyond transactional relationships. So I just want to talk about that because this is very much a part of the project and a part of the book. And so could you two specifically talk about what decolonizing our imagination means to you? Um, and yeah, we can just kind of chop it up around that. I'll look to Jamie first.
Sure. Yeah, I think like the first thing that comes to mind for me is um, really critically thinking about a lot of like traditional narratives that we face and rethinking like, how these have sort of affected the way we go about our lives and how we let those stories affect the ways we live. I guess like one thing I think about is I got into writing through like a lot of fantasy and science fiction, and there's always a lot of fantasy stories about like kingdoms and chosen ones, and I was really into that growing up because it just sounds so like epic and exciting, and so much potential for drama. But then when you really question that, there's so many like these stories of like conquering and hierarchies and military conquest that start to feel just I don't know like very, I guess like you mentioned, extractive and all about being dominant over the other party. So I think in my writing, as especially as I've entered climate fiction, hopeful fiction over the past several years, I've tried to think a bit more about just like the collective, ordinary people, um, like especially because with the challenges because climate change, we can't really depend on these narratives of like special chosen ones who will fix everything. It really has to start with everyone doing their own part. So I think that's a big thing that I've been sort of thinking about when it comes to this. I'll pass it to Lewis.
Yeah, this is going to be a totally new one, even though we have talked about this a couple times. But I think at this point, about a year and a half back, I read a book called Domination and the Arts of Resistance by James C. Scott, who recently passed away. A couple of his other books are more famous, probably most famous, Seeing Like a State. But in Domination and the Arts of Resistance, he has some really interesting stuff about how the idea that he's sort of working through in that book, and he looks at a bunch of different societies and examples, is how in societies with unequal distributions of power and with oppression, there's sort of a public discourse that gets invented, which is kind of a play that the dominant group orchestrates and then like compels, obliges everyone else to participate in. And then there are these separate private discourses. The dominant group's private discourse, although it's very similar and related to the sort of public agreed upon discourse, is its own thing. And of course, subaltern groups and groups that are outside of power or oppressed by power have their own private discourses, which are often completely different and also like very much informed by what's happening public. Like they're not, there's a lot of the societies he looks at, there's this part of the public performance is this idea that the groups that are oppressed are like, oh, well, they're not knowledgeable, they're not thoughtful, they're not sophisticated, they're not critical. That is the exact opposite of the truth. Everybody is, moving through these systems of structure and oppression in an interesting way. And I think when I was thinking about this piece, the piece that I wrote for GRIST last year, it's a piece about being Jewish in the diaspora, and the history of diaspora Judaism is this really weird history of being a group that often gets read as the sort of internal alien and sits in an uncomfortable position relative even to that sort of hierarchy, right? Like sometimes invited to participate in these dominant discourses, or sometimes leveraged, obviously sometimes excluded in, famously violent ways. And so I wanted to work with characters who had personal and generational gaps about whether they'd been inside or outside of these stories that societies were telling themselves, whether they'd been in the public story or not, what it means for the dividing lines on those sorts of tensions to cut through families and experiences. And so that's what I think about when I think about the themes you articulated.
Yeah, appreciate that. The piece around the chosen one is such a strong, it's there, right? It's everywhere. It seems like that type of story is just held up and kind of just permeates our society in a big way. And I like the idea of climate fiction focusing on community, chosen family, that sort of thing. And so that's what drew me to many of the stories that we've received and ended up publishing. This idea of narrative, though, Lewis, is something that I've been noodling on for, about 7 or 8 years now. And so that's partially why I got into the work of climate fiction, is to kind of push, or not even push, but, help get different narratives, different perspectives from all over the globe and into the marketplace, in front of people, and have folks read these stories. So let me go ahead and turn our attention, since we're talking about this global project that we do, sourcing stories from all over the world. I'm very interested in culturally authentic climate fiction, and I feel like the reason your stories are in the collection is because after like a few years of doing climate fiction at GRIST, we always had like known that we were going to get these stories from across the globe, but we didn't realize how rich they would actually be from a cultural standpoint. I probably should have thought of that when we launched the project, but it was something that was very clear after we, started receiving all the stories and reading them and reviewing them. And so, yeah, just let's talk about cultural authenticity, sorry, in culturally authentic stories, and how can we ensure that stories about climate change truly reflect the diverse lived experiences and perspectives of communities most impacted by the climate crisis. And I'm going to caveat that as a marketeer and the person that tries to source these stories, in the beginning of doing this, it was very hard because the systems out there for Americans, or folks that have been to college, or white folks, is a lot. There's a lot of systems in place in the literary space to kind of source those stories, and it's a lot harder to get to Nigerian stories, stories in the global South, Black American stories, Latinos, things of that nature. So just want you to talk about the importance of cultural authenticity to you in climate fiction. And do you know any kind of ways that we can kind of, get more folks involved that usually aren't showing up to the genre? I guess I'll start with Lewis this time, since I started with Jamie first.
Yeah, I mean, I want to. The first thing that I would say is it's really hard, and it's something that it's a challenge that I faced in various literary projects that I've worked on as well, and I haven't been as successful as I want to be. I think that building, you kind of have to start with the assumption that that different communities are doing things differently, and that there are sort of parallel worlds out there and experiences that are separate from the ones that you're familiar with, and then you have to reach out to them and build credibility, and sort of be open to uh, what to different ways of doing things, and different uh, expectations, and it's a lot of thoughtful work. I mean, I think that you've certainly not to just butter up the panel facilitator, but certainly I think it's clear that GRIST is putting in the work on that, and I think that the both the population of authors involved and the set of work shows that, and it's just something that you have to keep going on. I guess I can popcorn this over to Sanjana, because she's been able to join us now.
Yeah, hi guys. Sorry, I'm coming off a bit of a cold, so if my voice is a little scratchy, that's why. But I'm Sanjana, as Lewis said, and I'm glad to be here today. I think when it comes to bringing cultural stories to climate and to mainstream climate fiction, Tori, as you said, I think the biggest hurdle is that a lot of people that are going through the worst of it right now might not have time to sit down and take a pen in their hands and figure out how they want to communicate a story about it narratively. So I think a lot of it is about having connectivity between people on the front lines and people who do have a pen in their hands. And how do we find ways to learn ethical storytelling so we can care for other people's stories in the right way? And also that way connect these stories to the mainstream, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Sorry, I was trying to find the mute button after all these years. I should just like know where it is. Yeah, and so I guess I agree with all this, and I think that it's really important to kind of do what you all are talking. Two things. The relationship building is key, right? And the thing that exists out there as a marketeer, so I'm just kind of like pulling the curtain back to kind of explain to the audience like how tough it is to kind of get diverse stories. One, because diverse stories and folks that are on the front lines, because of some of the things Sanjana was talking about. It's just tough when you're kind of going through a climate crisis and things are like literally impacting your real world logistics and life and family. But then there's this other piece that there's this online kind of system of, like if you put out a call for submissions, a lot of the spaces that, hold these kind of ecosystems are the mainstream. And so you really have to build relationships. And that's what we did from the ground up. And we're trying to do that with like every country because we're quite ambitious, in which we can't do, of course, in a realistic way. But we have been able to make inroads in, just to name a few countries that we're really building some inroads in, is Nepal, India, Nigeria, Ireland. And so we continue to do that. And if there's anyone on the call that's interested in collaborating with us, feel free to reach out. And you can find us at Imagine 2200 on the GRIST site. And so, well, the other piece around this is around just the importance of, cultural, authentic climate fiction, not just sourcing it, but like, what does that do for the genre? And what does it add, to the kind of stories that we're building out there? And why do we need culturally authentic stories? I'll popcorn this to Jamie.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've noticed a lot is, especially like when I think about recent years, is sort of the increase in, I guess, like Asian-inspired fantasy settings or science fiction settings. That was certainly something I didn't have growing up. It was all sort of set in like a generic medieval, like European medieval sort of kingdom. And then so, and I think having more of these like Asian inspired fantasies that are, written by authors with lived experiences and are culturally authentic have really drawn a lot more. It's sort of just like it inspired, I guess, yeah, a lot more like Asian American readers, and other Asian American writers who are interested in writing these stories. So then if you add climate fiction into the mix, it's like, oh, so now I can, people who have never heard of climate fiction or hopeful fiction and see how it crosses with their own lived experiences or, what they imagine they want the future to be or how they see climate resilience happening in their own lives. I think having that intersection is a way to bring more people into like this sort of thinking about how can we try to imagine different futures through the power of fiction. So it's sort of like, yeah, bringing new audiences in and making them see themselves as a part of the solution.
Yeah, I'm gonna, unless someone wants to continue, I'm gonna move on. I want to talk about your specific stories, and you know, we have you here, so let's talk about the stories and not just the project and kind of like the kind of bigger things. I definitely think it's important to talk about the role of climate fiction, the role of our imagination, and how we use those things in the public. And this idea of decolonizing the imagination is something that I will be endlessly thinking of because for me, that's the goal, is to continue to decolonize, to continue to decolonize in different spaces. And right now I'm focused on this space. So, Lewis, I'll turn to you. In your story, A Satyr in Siberia, the family adapts their Seder ritual to accommodate the new realities of their situation. You've talked a little about this before, you and I love chopping it up with you. So I think it's important for folks to hear this. But would you where did you get the premise for your story, and why did you focus on the Seder and Jewish cultural traditions? You spoke a little bit about that, but could you, speak about?
Yeah. I mean, so specifically on the adaptation, it's very well attested that Passover, the rules of Passover already have climactic adaptations baked into them, baked being a very funny word choice there. So you're all welcome to laugh at this point. But no, so Passover is a Jewish holiday. It occurs in the springtime. It lasts 8 days. It commemorates the events of the biblical Exodus. And one of the commandments is that you're not supposed to have any leavened bread. And what counts as leavened bread is, of course, hotly debated. And an interesting fact about this observance is that two different major lineages within Judaism, Ashkenazi Judaism and Sephardic Judaism, answer the question of whether rice counts as leavened bread differently. Ashkenazi Jews hold the standard answer. For the record, I'm not committing to successfully abiding by Passover rules myself, but the standard Ashkenazi answer is that rice is leavened bread, and the standard Sephardic answer is that it's not. And the only only a hint cynical historiographical explanation for this is that Sephardic Jews who lived first in the Iberian Peninsula and then sort of throughout the North African and Middle Eastern world had diets that were very rice heavy, and it wasn't practical to turn off the rice faucet for the entire week. And Ashkenazi Jews who lived in northern, central, and eastern Europe did not have rice-based diets. And so we're very happy to put it on the list of things that you're not supposed to eat for 8 days. So, one of the notes in my story was that we see that there are various sort of food adaptations that have responded to it, and I think that that's something that I see in my own history, is that especially in living in a diaspora and responding to food and other environmental considerations where you are is something that you already do. And there's this sort of, there's a on the one hand a performance of like, well, this is exactly what you've eaten since time immemorial, and then on the other hand it's like, well, you have to put on the plate what's available to eat in the place that you are. I think the reason that I went to this, and I honestly, when I was thinking about what story I wanted to write for GRIST, I knew I wanted to write something that was in conversation with my Jewishness, and I looked at some other holidays, and Seder is not necessarily the most obvious one, because Tu B'Shvat, which is the birthday for every tree, really, is sort of an immediate standout. And there was a whole other draft. It was called a Haggadah for Tu B'Shvat. I found out that people do Haggadahs for Tu B'Shvat. Anyway, but I think that one of the reasons that my story ended up being about the Seder is because it gave me the opportunity to write a family from personal experience, and the Seder has been the holiday that involved, maybe more than any other, my actual family coming together. And so, and again, some of the themes I was talking about different generations and existing conflicts and so on and so forth, not expressed in the context of Siberia being rewilded through genetically engineered woolly mammoths, as appear in the our lovely illustration that GRIST did for the piece. But they were expressed in my own life, and so that was a jumping off point for the narrative.
Yeah, and see how much so this is the thing. My background, and many people don't know this, especially people on the that I don't know. I, cultural anthropology is a little bit of my background. So like the cultural piece is interesting to me. It keeps me engaged. I learn new things about other cultures, and that's like one part of like I care about the climate, but I want a story that is engaging, and I think other cultures have a lot to offer, and so I appreciate like I didn't know half the things that you just like talked about, and I have many Jewish friends, so the continuation of learning about cultures is a big part of this. So with that in mind, let's go over to you, Sanjana, and talk about your story. So you wrote Cabbage Cora, and in that story, you depict intergenerational transmission of culture, traditions like making of cabbage cora. How does intergenerational transmission of knowledge and practice contribute to the resilience of communities and the preservation of cultural identity in the face of climate change?
I love that question. Thank you, Tori. So, yeah, I based the story off of a real interaction that me, my mom, and my grandma had in 2023, which was this like delightful FaceTime call where all three of us are cracking up because my grandma is trying to show us a cabbage and she's just aiming nowhere near the cabbage. And so it had all of us it was just so funny. And if you know my grandma, she's been FaceTiming us for like I don't know, maybe like 10 years, and she still doesn't fully understand where to point the camera. So we always see like her forehead or like her ceiling or something like that. And that's been like a decade of interactions with her because she lives so far away from me. And so that element of diaspora, that element of being separated from your direct lineage, the direct women in your family, that's something that my grandma experiences because my mom lives in Utah, something that my mom experiences because I live here in LA. And I think the reason I pulled on that and the reason I look at sort of intergenerational experiences and relationships is because when I think about how scary the crisis ahead of us can be, I'm like, you know what? My ancestors, my elders, my own mother, they have gone through their own version of crises and they have found ways through it and they have found ways through the sort of the side effects almost of crisis, like migration and diaspora, right? Like those are things I think about a lot where I'm like, what am I going to do if I have a daughter and I'm as close to her as my mom is to me, and she moves away because LA is not a safe place for her to raise her family, and there aren't opportunities for her in a place like LA. And then I remember that my grandma's gone through that, my mom has gone through that, and so I can look back at their experiences and the way that they have handled these things and the perspectives that they have about these things to apply that to my life as I look ahead to the crisis that my generation faces. And I think that's sort of the key with intergenerational wisdom is realizing that every era has had its crises and every culture has had its ancestors who have met those crises with a certain vigor and a certain imagination. And that's what we can kind of draw on to then like apply that spirit to whatever we're facing.
Yeah, I love that. I have yeah, I just when you said grandmother and you're talking about your grandmother and ancestors, I remember my great grandmother used to have this I guess like her own little tradition of talking to her ancestors. And I, as a little kid, used to sneak and kind of listen and sit by the stairs and kind of listen to her dialogue with like her, past mother, brother, different people. And I didn't understand at the time, but now I really appreciate like those kind of moments and like what she was doing there. And she was asking for advice. She was like, it was real conversations. I thought it was quite weird when I was a kid, but now with like a lot more wisdom and reflection, I can dig it. Um, well, Jamie, oops, I hit the freaking mute button. Sorry. Sorry, y'all. So, Jamie, we're going to switch it up a little bit, still talk about culture, but from a different angle. So, you know that I'm on this thing around loneliness in America and how it's like an epidemic. And I'm like, we need to get together, y'all. We need to be friends. We need to like create a sense of belonging. The climate crisis is something we can kind of that creates a sense of belonging if we're all fighting towards a better future and a better world. How do we bring more people in? And so your story addresses loneliness, and so I see that as like a cultural element, even though the story isn't specifically in the United States. And so I just want to talk about that. Like, there's this societal failure to kind of address the environmental degradation that we're in, and then also a, a dual crisis, if you will, of fostering meaningful human connection. How can climate fiction and hopeful visions, help bring these people together so that we have people that care about community and who maybe even they care about community, but they don't know how to find it? Well, I guess I'm saying is like, how can climate fiction help human flourishing and like, I don't know, help us get together and like not be so lonely?
Yeah, I think like something when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write for my story, something I was really interested in was like the labor that goes into relationships, and especially trying to go beyond like transactional relationships, trying to really foster a deep sense of connection and belonging with people. I sometimes feel like I don't know I require so much more like love that the modern world feels equipped to give most people. Um, and yeah, just like, and then I was sort of thinking about bees and how, they have this relationship with the environment, in which they're supporting, the ecosystem around them, but in turn also supporting themselves. So in my story, I was trying to explore a bit about, relationships that, can sometimes become a bit uncomfortable because we people like when you show up for someone, you're holding each other accountable. You might have to like call each other out for like toxic ways of interacting. You might have to become a lot more vulnerable than you are used to becoming. But to sort of face to face the crisis that we have ahead of us, I think that is where we need to go. Learning how to be more uncomfortable with each other, and I think that's the basis of really what really fosters like stronger connections and helps us through this loneliness. Because otherwise, we do sort of isolate ourselves and feel like human relationships aren't worth it because they come with all this extra work that we have to do. But that work is actually really needed, and um, I also think like we associate work with jobs and that can lead to a lot of burnout if we feel like that's the same kind of work we have to put into our relationships, but it's a totally different sort of labor. um, and yeah, I think it's worth exploring.
Yeah, and yeah, that it's like half the reason I continue to kind of be on this, I my previous title at GRIST was a network weaver. So I'm a person who really loves to connect with people, and like Zoom is great, but I'd rather like sit over coffee and talk like about these things. And so building relationships is like a key part of who I am. And so I'm always wanting to like, I just feel like the other day, my daughter, this is a story, went across the street to be with this woman who her husband has passed and she lives alone and she was very lonely and she expressed that. And so my daughter wanted to kind of be with her and just like, offer some, human connection. And I was like, yes, I'm doing something right. So relationship building is really a part of like who I am, and I really want that to spread. And I love stories that do that. And so I feel like all of your stories you know, Jamie, yours doesn't have as much like where there's like a whole bunch of people kind of holding and helping the main character, but there are like two central characters that are really interested in this woman not being lonely and trying to find connection. Why don't we stay with like human connection? Lewis, you went with family. Sanjana, you went with family. The role of family in storytelling, I think, is quite powerful. It could be chosen family, or it can be your immediate family or extended. Um, Lewis, I think we've heard from you like why you focused on family. Sanjana, do you want to talk about why you focused on family outside of kind of the ancestral wisdom, or maybe that was like the impetus?
Yeah, I think the reason I focus on family is because kind of what you were saying, we have chosen family and then we have, actual relatives. And I think that I feel really grateful in my real life, right? Because Cabbage Cura is a prognostic autobiography, so it's sort of like based on my own life, and it's based on me imagining what my life might look like in 2047 and 2077, which was my way of just sort of like wringing the sponge of climate anxiety just by facing that fear head on and saying, what are these decades possibly going to look like for me? And I think when doing that, I felt very grateful and very rich with chosen family. But I realized I feel very, very far from my actual blood relatives. And I think this was my way of figuring out what do I do and how will I survive if that tradition of being far from blood family persists. What are ways that things can still keep us tied together in diaspora? So it's sort of like a longing for family, because I think one of the elements also in the story is technology, and the way that FaceTime right now helps me stay connected to my grandma. What might technology in the decades in the future look like that can help me stay connected to my mom, my possible future children and grandchildren? And I think there's an element with that where the technology brings us closer or keeps us close, but also really starkly shows that we are not together and that we are not anywhere physically near each other, and that like no amount of pixels, no matter how fancy they get, will ever replicate the feeling of actually being physically with your loved ones. So I think my story focuses on family partially as a tone of appreciation to the women in my family who I attribute everything to, but also to sort of speak to and process that sense of longing that like I'm not with them right now, and I'm probably never going to move to like back to India, right? My mom's probably never going to move back to India, so my grandma will probably never live with her again. And what happens then if I experience the same thing when I'm a grandmother? So it's just my way of sort of like dealing with the beauty of family at a distance.
Appreciate that. Lewis, did you want to hop in and talk?
Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking about this, and never let an author tell you that uh, a theme or a deeper metaphor in their work was intentional. We love to say it. It's because we love to lie. The And I was thinking a lot, and I hadn't thought about when I was writing this. The sort of central inciting event of A Satyr in Siberia is the return of an estranged family member to the home, on the occasion of this holiday. And I guess because I control the narrative, he shows up at the most dramatic possible time, and you can sort of see his shadow in the doorway there. And the story is moves immediately forward from that. The idea that he would return, or that whether he was going to return, and what it would mean if he could make it, sort of comes up a lot. And I had not asked myself, writing this, why he decided to do so. And I had not, and if you sort of turn the question on its head, right? Like uh, there's based on the way the story's structured, he really had the option, right? He had to show up, put in a lot of work, and make a bunch of sort of affirmative decisions under a series of difficult conditions to get there. He's turns out he's come back from Texas. They're in Siberia. It's a future where travel is not necessarily the simplest and most complicated. He gets attacked by bears. So and and I hadn't thought about that a lot. And I think in my family, my extended family, there's a lot of good feeling, and there are a lot of complicated feelings, and there are a lot of people who might or might not show up for stuff, and if they did or didn't, the level of friction would change. And but there's also simultaneously this sense of obligation, the sense of the uh, covenant of destiny, and the affirmative decision to continue to recognize it. And yeah, so I ended up writing a story that's about someone who I don't think of him as the protagonist, right? But obviously he thinks of him as the protagonist. It's maybe not a coincidence he's named after my brother instead of named after me. And, and he made kind of a bold choice to recommit to and return to a family that he has complicated feelings around. And I hope that he's rewarded for that. I think that it was ultimately a wise decision. Anyway, none of that's super definitive, but I guess these are the sort of life choices that don't have super definitive answers.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, we're getting not to the end, but we have time for Q&A now. So I'll start asking some of the questions from the audience members. But if you have any questions, please put them in. I guess there's like a box on your screen that you can enter. So if you have questions, add them. They'll be lifted up to me, and I can ask folks these questions. So the first question that we have from the audience, I don't have who it's from, but that's fine. But here's their question. What constitutes the climate part of these climate stories? I'm wondering if this is less about the climate aspects per se, and more about that as a backdrop for multi-solving, solutioning for a better future world in general. I can pose that to you all, but I guess I'll answer just from my perspective. Yeah, we're trying to do a lot of things with Imagine 2200. And I think that these things intersect. Like, the reason we have justice at the table and think it's important is because it is important, but also it's a part of the climate crisis that we're involved in. The people most impacted are the people that have the least power, the people that are marginalized. So that's one aspect of why it's not just about like the climate. From these stories aren't just like, hey, here's a climate solution. There's like, it's kind of multi-solving, as you said in your question. And then the other piece often that we get is, we have some of these stories are dialed up where there's a lot more climate centric story, and some of them are dialed down where the family aspect or the romance aspect is a way deeper and more front stage, but it's still a climate story. It's just that it's not slap you in the face climate. So that's how I would kind of answer this question. We are trying to do multiple things here. I'll throw this over to Jamie, and just, or when you write a story, are you trying to do multiple things? Are you trying to multi-solve in a way?
Yeah, I think like the one of the themes I'm particularly interested in most of my writing is this idea of like found family or chosen family. And I think like the like sort of unrelated, but the reason climate came into my writing is because it's what I do for my day job. And so I was like, oh, I have like a lot of expertise here. I should try to explore this intersection between writing and climate. But then, the more you work on climate, the more you sort of see how intersectional it is with everything. And the opportunity that comes with fighting the climate crisis is the opportunity to change all the systems that are currently surrounding us. And so that includes changes to family systems, how we live with each other, how we form communities with each other. So it's sort of like, I guess, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if I would call climate a backdrop in that way, but maybe it's this universal challenge tied to so many other things, which makes it really interesting to think about because there's so many ways you can go about it. Like something else that comes to mind is that I've had a lot of friends um, talk to me recently about like they want to find ways they can help in this time, you know, like friends who live in LA who were affected by wildfires, or friends who just want to help under the current administration we're living under. And, you know, it's like when crisis comes about, you turn to the people around you, you try to find out how they're helping, and you want to join them. It's just like we feel so powerless when we're alone, but in finding community, we feel that there's so much more um, ability to take on these great things. So yeah, there's definitely a big overlap between climate and community, and that's um, the big thing I'm interested in with my writing.
Cheers to that. I appreciate that. Um, well, does anyone want to field this question, or should I move on to another one?
I'll add one thing, which
Okay.
is I think it's such a good question because um, I had three different ways that I thought of answering this when I first read this question. And the more I think about it, the more I feel like, you know, it's not that climate change is going to come, the climate has already changed. And so I feel like any story that you are writing about now or about the future, there are two options. You either look at that reality and incorporate it into your story. You're paying attention as you write your story, or you're not. And I think that I think for me, a climate story is a story that pays attention to that reality and incorporates that reality into whether it's the foreground or the background of the story. Because for decades, we've had a, excuse me, a very well-funded effort by fossil fuel companies to make sure that we are not putting the reality into any stories, whether that's through TV, movies, literature, etc. There's, documented campaigns by ExxonMobil to not only make the science around climate feel doubtful, but also to make us question, obviously, like the human impact on it, and to also make the solutions seem out of reach. And so I think that through that narrative haze, even though we've known about this for decades, it has not shown up in our storytelling for decades. And I think climate stories it's just about changing that. It's about saying like, okay, we're finally acknowledging that like this is the reality, and it does not make sense to write stories that do not incorporate this reality either in real or fictional ways, whether about the present or about the future. We haven't been doing it for decades. And when we have panels like this, like my dream would be that in a handful of years, this would be a redundant discussion, because climate change would be so obviously a part of every story, part of the mainstream, that we wouldn't have a separate genre or a separate niche or a separate anything. It would just be like how we tell stories because we're not delusional, And I think that's like Amitabh Ghosh calls it the great derangement, right? That like we think we can write stories that do not incorporate our reality. So I think climate change is just about, or climate stories are just about like finally changing that and being like, no, we've known forever, and let's write like we know about it, let's not write like we're deranged. So I think that's sort of the marker for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Sanchana said a bunch of stuff that was that I was also thinking. So first of all, thank you, and probably better than I would have. I think one of the reasons why the GRIST community is a really interesting place is that some people come into it from their work on climate change, and some people come into it, like me, more from sort of speculative fiction. And there's a discussion now, and I think it's heated up and gone in some interesting directions about like to what extent are science fiction authors thinking and writing about the future versus contemporary problems. And it's worth noting that a lot of it is about responding to the social environment that they're in, and it's not strictly like an act of prognostication. But at the same time, I think that when science fiction is set in the future, to do right by that from a creative perspective involves sitting down and thinking seriously about the future. And not every type of change, first of all, obviously everyone's going to agree on exactly what type of changes are likely or which ones they want to consider, and not every story has to cover every type of change, and so on and so forth. But I think that from a perspective of sort of honoring the creative assignment, as it were, science fiction, when it fails to do so across domains, becomes an obvious creative weakness of the work. right? And there are, for example, there are periods in sci-fi where you can tell that the authors are like, okay, I'm penciling in that gender relations as I'm fantasizing about them in my exact decade or maybe the previous decade are going to apply indefinitely into the future. And you read that and you're like, oh, this is just a part of that book that was bad. Like, I'm not even saying like you needed to be like, you should have projected a morally upstanding or an uplifting or critical in the way I agree with, but like, wow, that was kind of like lazy and also lousy. And when we talk about climate, like fiction is embedded in climate. The opening line of 1984 is about the temperature in the city of London in the distant future of the year 1984. Like, and is 1984 like a climate fiction novel? Like, no, but it does actually take a position on what the temperature of the city of London is going to be. And I think that when you look at a lot of the history of science fiction, if you look at stuff from like a century plus ago, there's a lot of interest in the idea that like in the glorious techno future, we'll successfully exterminate all wild animals, which of course we all want to do. Like, I don't agree with any of that, but there's this sort of future lookingness to it, right? If you look at stuff from the height of the Cold War, there's like, oh, in the glorious future, we'll all live in horrible radioactive ash wastelands again. Like, let's not do it. But there was an interest in it. And so I completely agree with Sanjana that to the extent that visions of the future are not contextualized with some thought about how climate change happens, it's precisely because of the kind of political project that works to suppress the idea that that's a question and like invites you to take the fundamentally creatively bankrupt idea of being like, oh, I'll just pencil in exactly what's happening right now. It's like, no, you won't. Like, come on. Anyway, and I'm totally normal amount of heated about this. So thank you everybody for listening to me on that one.
Well, maybe we can transition at the end here to talking about Lydia, or someone asked us, how do you find joy in resilience with all the negative impacts of climate change? So what keeps you going? What gives you joy? We only have about 3 minutes, so it's gonna have to be quick. You want to go, Jamie?
Sure. I'll say like for me, climate organizing has been really sort of keeping me a little sane. I think being in community with like-minded people who are trying to do something has made me feel like I'm not just spiraling by myself in my room. So yeah, I'll for the sake of time, I'll leave it at that and kick it to Sanjana.
Yeah, I love this question. Like, I think you have to find joy like it's your job. Like, that is your number one job. If you care about anything in this world, it's about finding joy because you have to know if you are participating in any of these movements, or even if you're not, like, if you're just here, what are you here fighting for? And you're fighting for the things that you love, you're fighting for the things that bring you joy. And so I think you have to like be so, so tapped into that because if you stray away from the spirit of joy, you'll forget what our goal is and you'll forget like what we are hoping everyone has access to on this earth. Like that's why that pleasure of being on planet Earth is like why we want ourselves and our planet to survive. And you have to know that and you have to feel it every day because otherwise you kind of deviate from the spirit of why we're doing this in the first place. So whether it's like food, dance, for me, those are the things that show up in my story. And that's in the story, that's what like keeps my character going through her almost like kind of in the end to like almost her like dying days. And you have to find whatever that is for yourself, like it's your job.
Lewis, I'm gonna have you close it out. Turn it over to me.
No, I'm not gonna follow that one. I am just gonna nod appreciatively to it. I have a lot I could say about this, but for going out on a question about joy, I'm gonna let Sanjana take the wheel.
Yeah, that's fine. I appreciate that. Well, it's really been great talking with you all. I appreciate it as I always do because, actually, again, because I love people and you love you all, and this is my community, and this is what brings me joy. So I really hope that we get to do this again sometime soon. I'll kick it over to Lily to close it out, but thank you to the folks at Great Northern, and thank you to Milkweed Editions. And as always, if you want to find good climate fiction, you can go to grist.org and just search climate fiction. You'll be able to find some really great stories there. The project's called Imagine 2200. And don't forget, we have books too. And so the book that's available now is Metamorphosis. And you can find that on the website of Milkweed Editions.
Fabulous. Thank you all so much. I think I can speak on behalf of the audience, just like a big round of applause to the conversation. I was saying in our prep beforehand, I was like, this is exactly the balm that we need for this moment. So thank you all so much for being here. Tori actually like said most of the points that I was going to say. There's a link in the chat to this anthology that these wonderful authors are featured in. The Great Northern has programming in the Twin Cities through Sunday. And there's a link in the chat to kind of see more what's going on there. And as part of our broader climate solution series, we'll be compiling an action guide that will include recordings of the sessions, places to learn more, and tangible action steps that you can take around climate action. And so make sure you're on the list to receive that. I think if you registered for the session, you'll automatically get that. But if you matriculated in some other way, make sure to get on the list so we can keep moving forward together to protect our planet and foster relationships with each other in the ways that we're so wonderfully spoke about in this session. So thank you all so much for being here. And I'm going to kind of close us out with a quick little video from NPR, who's one of our partners for the festival. So thank you all so much for being here.